That night in Sydney, Whitney Houston stood in her dressing room, contemplating walking away from the biggest comeback performance of her career. What happened next would transform everything she thought she knew about her legacy. Subscribe and hit that notification bell for more incredible untold stories about music's greatest legends. It was March 15th, 2010, and the Sydney Opera House buzzed with anticipation. Whitney Houston's comeback tour had been making headlines worldwide, but not all for the right reasons. Critics questioned whether the voice could still deliver the magic that made her a global icon. Tonight's sold-out performance would either cement her triumphant return or become another painful reminder of what once was. Whitney stood motionless in her elaborate dressing room, staring at herself in the ornate mirror. The woman looking back showed evidence of a life lived at extremes, incredible highs and devastating lows. At 46, she was fighting battles most people couldn't imagine. Vocal challenges requiring constant management, industry skeptics questioning whether her time had passed, and personal demons whispering doubt into every quiet moment. Her black sequined gown hung perfectly on her elegant frame, but she felt like wearing a costume for a role she no longer knew how to play. The pressure was suffocating in its intensity. Every note tonight would be analyzed, compared to past performances, judged against an impossible standard. The Whitney Houston of 1992, who could effortlessly soar through octaves. "Ms. Houston, you have visitors," her assistant knocked gently, voice carefully modulated to avoid adding tension. "I told you explicitly, no visitors tonight. I need complete focus," Whitney replied, not turning from her reflection, voice carrying exhaustion. "Ma'am, it's someone who says it's urgent, a young woman who claims you changed her life and has something important to tell you." Whitney sighed deeply. Another eager fan who'd somehow manipulated her way past security, probably wanting a photograph or autograph. She'd learned to be gracious about these interruptions, but tonight felt monumentally different. Tonight she needed every ounce of emotional energy for what lay ahead. But the young woman outside her door would prove anything but ordinary. "Give me 5 minutes," Whitney called out, applying final touches to her makeup with slightly trembling hands. She smoothed her gown and took what she assumed would be her final look before facing another well-meaning fan interaction. When Whitney opened the door, she found herself face to face with someone whose presence would transform her understanding of everything she'd accomplished in her 25-year career. Standing before her was a young woman, probably early 20s, with intricately braided hair and nervous energy. Whitney recognized immediately. The same energy she'd carried decades ago when young and desperate to prove her talent was real. This girl had something familiar in her eyes, something speaking of late nights in recording studios and hours spent perfecting vocal runs. "Ms. Houston, my name is Alicia Keys," the young woman said, voice trembling but carrying determination. "I know you don't know me, but I had to come here tonight. I had to tell you something I've never told anyone. Something that will change how you see your career." Whitney studied the girl's face with attention to detail that had served her well in a business full of hidden agendas. There was something authentically earnest about this Alicia Keys, something in her posture suggesting genuine artistic dedication rather than fame-seeking opportunism. "Alicia Keys," Whitney repeated slowly. "Wait, aren't you that young woman who just signed with J Records? The piano player who writes her own songs?" Alicia's eyes widened with genuine surprise. "You actually know who I am?" "Honey, I make it my business to know about young talent coming up in this industry, especially young women trying to make their mark in what's still very much a man's world." Whitney stepped aside, gesturing for Alicia to enter the dressing room. "What's so urgent that couldn't wait until after the show?" Alicia took a deep breath, drawing strength from some hidden reservoir, hands clasped tightly as if holding something precious. What she was about to reveal would shock Whitney to her core and completely reframe everything the legendary singer thought she knew about influence and legacy. "Ms. Houston, for the past 6 years, I've been studying you with an intensity that probably borders on obsession," Alicia began, words coming in a carefully controlled rush. "I'm not talking about casually listening to your albums or attending concerts. I'm talking about frame-by-frame analysis, note-by-note dissection, breath-by-breath examination of every recorded performance you've ever given." Whitney felt strange combination of flattery and bewilderment. Well, that's certainly dedicated, but lots of singers are influenced by other artists. That's how musical evolution happens. No, you don't understand the depth of what I'm trying to tell you, Alicia pressed on, voice gaining strength. I'm not talking about influence or inspiration. I'm talking about direct instruction, systematic education, unconscious mentorship that has shaped every aspect of my musical development. The weight of Alicia's words began settling in the room like a heavy blanket. I have every performance you've ever given preserved on video, concerts, awards shows, television appearances, music videos, even bootleg recordings. I've watched your 1991 Super Bowl performance of the Star-Spangled Banner over 200 times, analyzing frame by frame how you support your breath during those impossibly high notes. I've studied your Grammy performance of I Will Always Love You to understand how you build emotional intensity throughout a song without losing technical control. Whitney slowly lowered herself into her chair, full implications of what Alicia was revealing beginning to hit her with seismic force. I've spent countless hours rewinding and replaying your live performances to understand the mechanics of how you transition between chest voice and head voice so seamlessly that it sounds like natural breathing. The way you use vibrato not just as vocal ornamentation, but as emotional punctuation. The way you save your biggest vocal moments for maximum psychological impact. Ms. Houston, you've been my primary teacher for 6 years, and until this moment, you never even knew I existed. The room fell into profound silence. This wasn't fan appreciation. This was something entirely different, speaking to the deepest questions about artistic legacy that she'd been grappling with for months. But Alicia wasn't finished. She reached into her leather bag and withdrew a worn notebook, pages thick with use and cover marked with careful handwriting. This is my Whitney Houston study guide. I started keeping it when I was 16, the day after I heard Greatest Love of All for the first time, and realized I was listening to something that transcended music and entered the realm of pure emotional truth. Whitney took the notebook with trembling hands. As she opened it, her breath caught. Page after page contained meticulous musical notations, detailed observations about vocal techniques, and analyses written with doctoral precision. There were charts showing her vibrato, progression patterns in different songs, extensive notes about how she used dynamics to build and release tension, and even observations about stage movements affecting vocal production. My God, Whitney whispered, flipping through what amounted to a graduate-level course in Whitney Houston vocal methodology. You documented all of this? Every piano lesson I took, every voice coaching session, every songwriting workshop. I was constantly thinking about how I could incorporate your approach into my artistic development, Alicia explained, voice thick with emotion. When I learned classical piano technique, I was always asking myself fundamental questions. How would Whitney Houston approach this melody? How would she make people feel something real and lasting? How would she take technical perfection and transform it into emotional transcendence? Whitney looked up from the notebook, eyes glistening with tears that had been building for months of self-doubt and industry pressure. But honey, you're a songwriter, a pianist, a completely different kind of artist. Why would you study a vocalist with such scientific intensity? Alicia smiled through her own tears, and Whitney saw something she recognized from her own younger self. The fierce determination of an artist who understood that greatness required obsessive attention to detail. Because you taught me the most important lesson any artist can learn. Technique without soul is just showing off, and soul without technique is just wishful thinking. You taught me that the goal isn't to hit the highest note or play the most complex progression or write the cleverest lyrics. It's to create a moment where another human being feels less alone in the world. The revelation hit Whitney with the force of recognition. This young woman had articulated something Whitney herself had felt, but never quite put into words. Every song I write, every arrangement I create, every performance choice I make, I run it through a filter I call the Whitney test. Alicia continued. I ask myself, would this make Whitney Houston proud? Does this honor the standard she set for emotional honesty in music? Ms. Houston, your invisible guidance has shaped every artistic decision I've made for the past 6 years. Whitney stood up abruptly and walked to the window overlooking Sydney Harbor. where city lights sparkled like earthbound stars. Her mind was reeling with the implications of what Alicia had shared. Here was concrete evidence that her work, her gift, her struggles, they had created ripples extending far beyond anything she could have imagined. Ms. Houston, my debut album, Songs in a Minor, is being released next month, Alicia continued. There's not a single vocal approach on that album, not a single emotional choice, not a single moment of artistic risk that doesn't have your fingerprints somewhere in its DNA. You've been my invisible mentor, my ghost teacher. You raised me musically without ever knowing my name. Whitney turned around slowly, and for the first time in months, there was something different flickering in her eyes. Something that looked almost like hope, mixed with wonder at the mysterious ways that artistic influence travels through time and space. Why are you telling me this now? Whitney asked, voice barely above a whisper. Why tonight, right before I have to walk onto that stage and prove to thousands of people that I can still do what I used to do effortlessly? Because I've been following your interviews during this tour, Alicia said quietly. I've heard you questioning whether your career still matters, whether you've made a difference, whether the struggle to maintain your voice and relevance is worth the pain it costs. Ms. Houston, you've made a difference in ways you can't even begin to imagine. Whitney felt something crack open inside her chest, like ice breaking up after a long winter. This conversation was touching places in her heart that had been frozen for months. You know what the most profound part of this revelation is? Alicia continued, stepping closer. I've been so focused on learning from you, on absorbing every lesson you've unconsciously taught, that I never stopped to think about how isolated you must feel. How lonely it must be to be the standard that everyone is trying to reach, including yourself. Those words cut deeper than any negative review or harsh criticism ever could. Whitney had spent so many years being Whitney Houston, the icon, the legend, the impossible standard, that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be Nippy, the girl from Newark who just wanted to sing in church and make people feel something beautiful. Can I ask you something personal? Whitney said, settling back into her chair and gesturing for Alicia to sit across from her. What's your favorite Whitney Houston song, and why? That's the easiest question you could ask, Alicia replied without hesitation. Greatest love of all. And not because of the vocal acrobatics, though they're transcendent. It's because of the message, the way you delivered a complex philosophical truth with such conviction that it became gospel. You taught me that learning to love yourself isn't just a nice sentiment. It's the foundation of everything else. And that lesson has literally saved my life more times than I can count. Whitney felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. She'd sung that song thousands of times over the years, but hearing it reflected back through Alicia's lived experience made her understand its power in a completely new way. You know what's ironically funny about this entire conversation? Whitney said, laughing through tears that had started flowing freely. I've been so worried about living up to who I used to be, so terrified of disappointing people who remember me at my peak, that I completely forgot about who I still am. You just reminded me of something I'd lost sight of completely. Alicia reached out and took Whitney's hands in hers, and the gesture was so natural and genuine that it felt like a blessing. Ms. Houston, what you used to be is absolutely amazing, historical, iconic, unrepeatable. But who you are right now, the woman who has survived everything she survived, who has fought through every battle and is still brave enough to get on that stage and share her truth, that's the woman I really want to learn from. There was a sharp knock on the door that seemed to echo through the entire building. Ms. Houston, 15 minutes to showtime. The audience is getting restless. Whitney looked at Alicia, then at her reflection in the mirror, and for the first time in years, she genuinely liked what she saw. Not because she looked perfect or young or like she used to, but because she finally understood her true value as an artist and as a human being. Alicia, I want you to do something for me tonight, Whitney said, standing up and adjusting her gown with renewed purpose. I want you to watch this performance from somewhere you can see everything, and I want you to witness something you've never seen before in all your years of studying me. What's that? You're going to see Whitney Houston learning from Alicia Keys. You're going to see what happens when a teacher discovers she still has things to learn from her students. As they walked through the backstage area toward the wings of the stage, Whitney felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The crushing anxiety that had been suffocating her for weeks was being replaced by something she'd almost forgotten existed. Genuine curiosity about how Alicia's perspective might change her approach to songs she'd performed hundreds of times. "Ms. Houston," Alicia said, as they reached the wings where stage lights were visible and the sound of the restless audience was growing louder. "Would it be okay if I watched from right here? I'd love to see you work up close, to finally witness in person what I've been studying from a distance for so many years." Whitney smiled, and it was the first completely genuine, unguarded smile she'd worn in months. It lit up her entire face and reminded everyone who saw it why she'd become beloved by millions. "Honey, after what you just gave me, after you just reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place, you can watch from wherever you want. In fact, I insist you stay right here so I can see you." The house lights began to dim, and Whitney could feel the energy of 2,700 people settling into expectant silence. Usually this moment filled her with dread so profound it was almost paralyzing. The pressure to be perfect, to recapture magic that might be gone forever. But tonight felt fundamentally different. As the opening notes of her first song began to play, Whitney turned to Alicia one last time. "Thank you for reminding me that my voice is just the delivery system. The real gift is what it delivers. Thank you for teaching me what that gift looks like when it's given with complete authenticity," Alicia replied. Whitney Houston walked onto the Sydney Opera House stage carrying something she hadn't brought to a performance in years: the knowledge that her legacy was already alive and thriving in ways she never could have imagined. As the spotlight hit her face and she opened her mouth to sing the first notes, she wasn't trying to be the Whitney Houston from any other era. She was being the Whitney Houston from March 15, 2010, scarred, imperfect, but still capable of creating moments of transcendent beauty. And in the wings, watching with tears streaming down her face and her notebook clutched against her chest, stood the young woman who would go on to win 15 Grammy Awards, sell over 30 million albums worldwide, and inspire a generation of artists herself. But that night, she was simply a student, watching her teacher rediscover the joy and purpose of teaching. The concert that followed was nothing short of transformative. Whitney's voice wasn't the same as it had been in her prime. It was something different, something deeper. It was wise, weathered, and profoundly human. She sang with the knowledge that her gift was bigger than perfect pitch or impressive range. Her gift was her ability to make others feel less alone, to create connection across every barrier that usually separates human beings. After the show, as the audience delivered a 10-minute standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Opera House, Whitney found Alicia exactly where she'd left her. "How did it feel out there?" Alicia asked, her eyes still bright with tears. "Like coming home," Whitney replied without hesitation. "Like remembering that I'm not just a voice or a performer. I'm a vessel for something larger than myself, and tonight I remembered how to let that something flow through me freely." 6 months later, when Alicia Keys' Songs in a Minor debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 and went on to sell over 12 million copies worldwide, earning 5 Grammy Awards including Best New Artist, she dedicated the album to all the teachers who shaped me, especially the one who taught me that greatness isn't about perfection. It's about the courage to be vulnerable and the wisdom to transform that vulnerability into healing for others. Whitney kept Alicia's study notebook in her dressing room for every subsequent performance for the rest of her career. Whenever she felt doubt creeping in, whenever the critics seemed too harsh or the expectations too overwhelming, she would open it and remember that her influence extended far beyond her own stage, her own songs, her own lifetime. The Sydney Opera House performance became legendary among Whitney's most devoted fans, not because it featured her most technically perfect vocals, but because it captured something more important: the moment when a legend remembered why she was legendary in the first place, and the precise instant when a student became a teacher in her own right. Years later, when Alicia Keys was mentoring young artists herself, She would tell them about the night she met Whitney Houston backstage in Sydney. "She taught me the most important lesson any artist can learn," Alicia would say. "Being an artist isn't about what you can do or how perfectly you can do it. It's about what you make possible for others, what doors you open, what healing you facilitate, what hope you kindle in hearts that had given up on beauty." Whitney Houston's legacy isn't just the 200 million records sold worldwide, the 6 Grammy Awards, the countless #1 hits, or even the incredible voice that dominated popular music for over 2 decades. Her true legacy lives in the artists she inspired, the students she never knew she had, the young woman who stood in a dressing room in Sydney and reminded a legend that her light was still shining brilliantly, just in ways she never expected to see. That night at the Sydney Opera House, Whitney Houston learned the most important lesson of her entire career. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't the one you consciously give, but the one that comes back to you, transformed and multiplied, through the hearts and voices and dreams of those you've touched without even realizing it. The voice that had moved millions was still moving people, still teaching, still healing, still opening doors for others to walk through. And sometimes when we're fortunate enough to witness it firsthand, that voice comes back to remind us that our greatest impact might be the one we never see coming, the one that grows in secret and reveals itself only when we need it most. If this incredible story of hidden mentorship and musical legacy moved your heart, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of unconscious influence. Have you ever been unknowingly mentored by someone you admired from afar? Tell us about it in the comments below. Don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing stories about the hidden connections between music's greatest legends.